Hi there and welcome to another video. This is Jennifer McGuire. So believe it or not, one of the questions I get asked most is how I create sentiment strips. Sentiment strips are tiny little sentiments that go across your card, and they're fun because you can place them anywhere. Well, I get a lot of questions about how to get them perfectly centered, get them spaced just right, and stamped just perfectly. So today I'm sharing lots of tips and techniques for using sentiment strips on your cards. I have several examples, and I'm hoping that this inspires you to try sentiment strips on your card and come up with fun ways to use them. Let's start with an example where we do faux sentiment strips. This is actually a one-layer card, although it does look like there is dimension to it with those sentiment strips. I'm a big fan of one-layer cards, and I get a lot of requests to do more of them, so I thought I'd start with this. I'm using this new Simon Says Stamp Beautiful Flowers 2 stamp set. There was a Beautiful Flowers 1, and I used it in a video, and I'll link to it here. It was very popular, so here is the second version of it. It has a beautiful cluster of flowers, along with individual flowers, leaves, and beautiful sentiments. And I'll be using this set on 3 of my cards today. Another stamp set that I'll use throughout this video is the new Simon Says Stamp Tiny Word set. If you've watched my videos, you know I like small little sentiments that fit just about anywhere, and this one is super small, and there are so many occasions included in here. It's a great must-have set, and I'll use it in many ways today. You can stamp these just about anywhere on a card, or they're perfect for sentiment strips. You could even use them inside of cards. I'll also be using the new Simon Says Stamp Sentiment Label dies. I've been wanting a set like this for some time now. These dies will cut the perfect sentiment strip, and there are also these little V dies that you can use to cut little ribbon ends on the sentiments if you don't want to leave them straight. If you struggle with making the perfect sentiment strip, these may be the answer for you. In this video, I'll show how to use these and also how to create your own with a paper trimmer. Let's get started with the card where I do faux sentiment strips for a one-layer card. In my MISTI stamping tool, I have a piece of white cardstock that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm just using this cardstock to kind of place my stamp. I can save the piece for a future card, but I'm not using it today. I have a large image from the Beautiful Flowers 2 stamp set, the one that I just showed you, and I'm inking that up with Gina Jet Black Amalgam ink. This ink is friendly to almost all coloring mediums, so it's a good one to choose. I'll be using Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens here in a moment. Now with this piece, I will line up some sentiment strips that I cut with the dies that I just showed you from masking paper. That way they have some stick to it, and I can place them where I want them to be, and I can move them around if I want to. I'm using the grid in my MISTI stamping tool to make sure that I put them down straight. The reason I use those sentiment label dies to cut from this masking paper is so that I could kind of plan out where I want my sentiment strips to be. It's kind of like a tool to help me position. I often create masks to help me decide where to place things on my cards. I'm also going to use them in this case to do some actual masking. Once I have the sentiment strips positioned, I'm going to remove that piece that we stamped and add in a note card. This is a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch top folding Bristol cardstock note card. The reason I'm using Bristol cardstock is because I'm using Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens, and they work great on this cardstock. So I'm inking up the same image in the same position with the same ink and stamping it on top. You want to make sure that you stamp firmly so that you stamp right up against those sentiment strip masks that we have there. Next, I'll carefully remove the card from my stamping tool and fold the strips to the back so they won't move. I'll use a black pen to trace right around those sentiment strip masks. It's hard to see them in the picture here. However, they are there, and I'm just using my black pen to trace around them. This is very easy to do. You can either use a super fine tip pen or one that's a little bit wider, just depending on how much you want them to stand out. I'll link below to some black pens that I recommend for this use. So once I've traced all 3 of the sentiment strips, I can remove the mask, and then we have an open area where we can stamp our sentiments. If you do not have sentiment label dies like the ones I used, you could just cut your own sentiment strips from masking paper for this technique. Okay, so now it's time to add sentiments into those 3 open areas. I cut a few more masks with those label dies, and I'm positioning it right over one of the openings. I'll then take one of my tiny word sentiments and look from above. You got to get your head in front of the camera to do this, but I'm going to make sure that that's centered right over that little mask. So now I can go ahead and stamp on that mask, make sure I'm happy with the position, then remove the mask and stamp it on my card. Now you could have positioned it directly onto your card and stamped it, but at this point I don't want to mess up my card. So by stamping onto a mask first, I can be sure I like the position before stamping on my card. This takes an extra few minutes, but that saves me a lot of time from having to redo a card. So here, once again, I put a mask over the open area. I position the stamp. I'm testing it here. If I'm happy with the result, I can go ahead and stamp it into the open area. Sometimes taking the few minutes to create a mask to make sure your position is just right is worth the effort to make sure you come up with a card that you're happy with. Okay, so I went ahead and used my Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens to color these in. If you've never used these pens, I will link to a video here showing more about them. The reason I like them is they can be used with or without water, and you can blend with them and get beautiful results that are similar to Copic if you don't use water, or similar to watercolor if you do. You could do any kind of coloring here as long as you use a black ink that is friendly with that medium. I use the Gina K Amalgam Black Ink, which works with colored pencils, Zig Clean Color Real Brush, watercolor, Copics, and more. So it was safe to use with the Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens. Once I did all of my coloring, I wanted to add some shadows below the little sentiment strips, so it looks like there's dimension to them. For this, all you need is a light gray marker. I decided to use the chisel tip of my C5 Copic marker. This is a great gray color, and I'm using the die as a straight edge. You could use a ruler or a straight edge if you prefer. So I'm just drawing a line underneath my little sentiment strips, so it looks like there's some dimension to it. This seems subtle at first, but on the finished card, it really gives the look of dimension. I put a pretty thick line under there, but you could do thin if you prefer. I also stamped the same flower on a matching envelope from Gina K. This is a Lucky Clover color. And there we have our finished card. It has the look of dimension with those sentiment strips, but this is actually one layer. So if you have trouble positioning your little sentiments perfectly on a card, try creating a mask to just test it out before doing it on your card. It can save you a lot of time in the end. Okay, before we get into the basic use of sentiment strips, I wanted to show you another creative use. This time I'm doing negative sentiment strips. In this card, there are die-cut little windows where sentiments are set back. If you have any kind of sentiment label dies or other shape dies, this is a great technique. So let's start with the background. I'm using the My Favorite Things Radiating Halftone background stamp. And I'm inking this up with Simon Says Stamp Fog ink. This is a great soft ink that's subtle and great for backgrounds. I'm stamping this onto white cardstock. This is a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece. I have a lot of white cardstock and note cards pre-cut to this size since it's what I use most often. But in this case, I'm cutting a 1/2 inch off the side from that background we just stamped and our note card because I want one of the images to hang off the side of the card and still fit in the envelope. So here I have a flower that I stamped from the Beautiful Flowers 2 stamp set that I showed you earlier, and I colored it with the Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens. I used the coordinating die to cut it out, and I'm temporarily adhering it to the edge of the card where I want it to be positioned in the end. I also have some sentiment strips that I cut from those sentiment label dies. and I cut them from masking paper, once again, so I could figure out where I want them to be positioned. You can see I stamped the sentiment on it, just so I knew how far to the left I needed each of them to be. And I'm using a T-ruler to make sure that I put them down straight. So again, these are cut from masking paper, so these are just temporary. Now that I know where I want each sentiment strip to be cut, I can go ahead and remove the flower and then lay those masks back down. I'll use the same sentiment label die and line it up with the mask and put a piece of tape over it temporary so it doesn't move, and then I'll run it through my die cut machine. This will cut a perfect little sentiment strip in the location where we want the first sentiment to be. Now, you don't have to use those masks to make sure you get the perfect spot for your sentiments. However, again, I find it's helpful to use a mask just to make sure I get it right and I don't have to redo the whole card. Okay, so once I have all of those little slots cut, I have my note card, and I am going ahead and adding that little flower where I think it should be with that temporary adhesive. Now it's time to stamp the sentiments. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool. I find that the stamping tool is very helpful for getting great positioning. I'm putting my sentiment right into the first opening, then the second opening, and the third opening. You could use an acrylic block for this, but again, this will save me time and ensure I get it straight. There's a grid on the door of the MISTI, and that will also help me make sure that I have my sentiment straight. Okay, so now I'm using my anti-static powder tool. I'm stamping the 3 sentiments with VersaMark ink, and then I'll add white embossing powder to it. When you have tiny little intricate sentiments like this, I recommend using the Gina Detail White Embossing Powder. This is the best white embossing powder that I found, and when you heat set it, you'll get perfect results for these tiny little images. Here's a closer look and you can see how nicely they turned out. Now I can be sure my sentiments are lined up with those little holes that we die cut, since we did all of those little tricks to make sure the positioning was just right. I'm adhering a bunch of craft foam to the back of our stamped panel here and using Gina Connect glue to adhere it. I find that the more evenly you put craft foam on the back of this, the better it makes it through the mail than putting just a few foam dots here and there. So I'm putting adhesive on the back of this, adding it right onto our card. Remember, this card is now 5.5 inches by 3 3/4 inches. I used some foam tape to add our flower over the sentiment strips. And here is a regular envelope, and you can see how it still fits nicely. So we have that dimension so that our sentiments are set back into the strips, which is a fun change from just adding sentiment strips to the top of your card. In the center of the flower, I added some Nuvo glitter drops just for a bit of shine and dimension. Now that we covered a few unique ways to use sentiment strips on your cards, let's go back to the basics. This card features many sentiment strips. I'll be using a few new Simon Says stamp sets. This one has great encouragement sentiments. I'll be using this in a video tomorrow, but today I'm using the My Sweet Friend that's on the top of the set. In addition to this, I'll be using the tiny word set that I showed you earlier, and the spiritual sentiments. This is another new one. I really like the God Knew My Heart Needed You. I don't think there's a better sentiment out there. Also, there's created to create, thank you, grateful, be strong and courageous, many different sentiments. I really like that there's a variety of styles in that set, and also in this one, the Simon Says Stamp Uplifting Sentiment Stamp Set. I again will be using several from here, including You're an Inspiration, You da Best, Love You So Hard, You Are Loved, You're My Favorite, and I Am So Grateful for You. Okay, so now I'm going to create a background with lots of these sentiments that I just showed you. In my MISTI stamping tool, I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I'm starting in the top corner and just positioning sentiments very close to each other. This is one of my favorite things to do for a background. I take a bunch of sentiments from different stamp sets that I have, and put them very close together and stamp them on a background. I've done this in a video before, and I'll link to it here if you want to learn more about that technique. Once I have a bunch of sentiments down, I'm inking it up with Simon Says Stamp Fog Ink. This is that soft gray ink that I used before that's great for backgrounds. While I have those stamps positioned in my stamping tool, I can go ahead and make more cards. This time I'm going to use a slightly darker gray, a more cool gray. This is the Hero Arts Soft Granite ink. And I'll stamp that, and now I have another note card started, so I can make a couple at once. Now it's time to fill in the rest of the area. I'm just going to move the same sentiments to a new spot. I thought this was a good opportunity to show the difference between the Simon Says Stamp Fog Ink and the Hero Arts Soft Granite. You can see the two here. A lot of people ask about these. On the left, we have the Simon Says Stamp Fog Ink, which is a warm gray that's very light. On the right, we have the Hero Arts Soft Granite, which is a cool gray and a little bit darker. I really like both colors. It just depends on the card. Now I'm going in with a few little heart images to fill in any open gaps. Now it's time to add our sentiments to the top. I used those sentiment label dies that I showed you earlier to cut a few from some scrap colors of cardstock that I had. I decided to go for a rainbow. I also used the same dies to cut from some other scraps of cardstock, and I'm keeping the negative space. This is another tip for stamping perfectly onto thin strips. So here I'm planning out which sentiments are going to go where from the different sets that I showed you earlier. Now this is a great tip. This is one of the best ways to stamp perfectly onto little tiny die cuts of any shape. So here I have one of my small sentiments, and I'm just stamping it onto scrap paper using my stamping tool. Doesn't matter where you stamp it. Then I'm taking that negative space that I just showed you, and I'll position it perfectly around our little sentiment. You can do this with any shape, stamp, or die. Once I have it positioned perfectly, I'll pop my die cut into that little negative space, and then I'll stamp the sentiment onto it. Since I lined it up with the stamped sentiment on the scrap paper, this sentiment will end up perfectly positioned on the strip. If you have trouble die cutting perfectly around the image, try this, where you first stamp on scrap paper, line up a negative space around it, put your die cut into the opening, and then stamp onto the die cut. Now I know some people out there will think it's easier to die cut first and then stamp, but there are a lot of people who have trouble seeing that perfectly. So if you have trouble stamping perfectly onto a die cut, try this technique. It can really make a big difference. And sometimes when you've spent a lot of time on your card, you want to make sure you get it just right at the end. So this trick is very helpful. So here again, I'm stamping onto another sentiment strip, and you can see it's perfect every time. So I did that on a bunch of sentiment strips. Once I was done, I went ahead and used my trimmer to cut it down. I really like using my Tim Holtz Tonic trimmer. There's a little ledge here on the bottom. I can line it up with that and then cut any excess off. So here are all of my sentiment strips, including this big one that has the Friend die cut from the Simon Says Stamp Friends die set. I put foam tape on the back of it, but I'm also going to put some liquid adhesive onto that foam tape. The reason I'm doing this is it will help me to position this sentiment strip perfectly in the center of my card. I'm using a T-roller, but by putting that liquid adhesive on it, I can shift it to the left or the right and kind of wiggle it around until I'm happy with where it's positioned. I'll do the same for all the sentiment strips. I cut thin pieces of foam tape, put it on the back, put a little bit of liquid adhesive, which allows me to wiggle it and move it around onto my card to make sure I have it positioned before it stays in place. That liquid adhesive will dry very strong, and I don't have to worry about it moving, and the foam tape still gives it the dimension. You may notice that I'm using a T-ruler a lot in this video. It's another one of my recommendations for making sure that your sentiments are perfectly straight. It makes a huge difference, and it's an inexpensive tool. Okay, so I added all of my sentiments along with a few die cut hearts. It's a very simple card, but a great way to use a variety of sentiments together on one card. Most stamp sets have little sentiments that you can use, so you can grab them from different sets. This card design is also great for using up scraps or using any sentiments of any occasion for whatever card you may need. Okay, my last card example shows some floating little sentiment strips with some die cuts around them. Okay, so for this card, I stamped a bunch of green leaves from that Beautiful Flowers 2 stamp set that I showed you earlier. I stamped them with green ink, and now I'm just doing very basic Copic coloring. When I do basic coloring, all I do is some dark color towards the center, then medium color, and then light color towards the tip. And I don't worry about blending. I did this with 2 different shades of green, and I have the colors of Copic markers listed at the top, but you could do any coloring you may like. I then use the coordinating dies to die cut all of the stamped images, and I die cut from some craft foam. This has dimension, but it die cuts beautifully with those wafer thin dies. I then glued the craft foam die cuts to the back of the stamp die cuts, so they have some beautiful dimension to them. They look like little embellishments. This is a great way to add dimension to your cards, and it doesn't take time at all. Once I had a bunch of die cuts with craft foam on the back, it's time to create our sentiment strips. This is another way to create them if you don't have a stamping tool or dies. So I have an acrylic block with grid lines. I highly recommend acrylic blocks with grid lines because they help you with straight stamping. I lined up one of my small sentiments with the grid line. I'm using an anti-static powder tool since I'm doing heat embossing, and I'm stamping right along an edge up against the corner of a piece of scrap cardstock. This is just some scrap green cardstock that I had. I'm then adding some white embossing powder and heat setting it. By stamping against the edge and the corner, I can easily cut this into a perfect strip. I'm again using my Holtz Trimmer, and I can see the edge of the trimmer and where it will cut, and I can make sure that I have an even cut strip. There we have our little strip. And I can also use the trimmer to cut it on the edge and make sure there's an even amount all around. So this is another way to do it. This is the way I most often do, but I'm excited that companies are coming out with sentiment label dies because it makes it a lot easier. I really wanted to show a few different ways to create sentiment strips in this video because everybody's different and what works best for you may not work best for others. So give them all a try and see what works for you. I'm again using my T-roller to glue these onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card, making sure they're straight and centered. I'm using foam tape on the back of my sentiment strips and a little bit of liquid adhesive so I can move them around before I leave them to dry on my card. The 2 small sentiments are from the Tiny Words stamp set that I showed you earlier, and the thanks is from the Beautiful Flowers 2 stamp set, the same set those leaves are from. I cut all my sentiment strips to the same width so that they would kind of fit into a little rectangle at the top center of my card. Next, I'm going to put those leaves around them. And I'm cutting the edge of my leaves to make them look that they kind of are coming out from the edge of my sentiment strips. So I'm starting around the sentiment strips and working my way out to fill in the card area. I'm using liquid adhesive, which works great with that craft foam that we have on the back of our die cuts. And I'm leaving a little bit of gap between those die cut leaves and the sentiment strips. Now remember, anything you cut off from these little die cuts, you can use on the edge of your card to fill in the space. So I'll continue to do this process, again starting at the center and working my way out, filling in all the open areas. Every once in a while I stop and cut the excess off so that I can use those excess pieces to fill in some of the gaps. I also went in and added some Lucy's Cards gems to some of the open areas for a little bit of sparkle. So there you can see those sentiment strips that we created just by stamping on the edge of some scrap cardstock and cutting it with our trimmer. I added everything with craft foam or foam tape so there's lots of dimension. This is a great way to get more looks out of your sentiment strips and little images that you may have in your stamp sets. So there you have a few different ways to create perfect sentiment strips and different techniques for using them on your cards. I hope you'll give this a try. I do link all of the supplies that I featured in my description below. In the middle are a couple other videos that may be helpful to you. If you haven't done so, hit subscribe so you can see future videos, and give this a thumbs up so YouTube knows you like this type of video. I appreciate you spending time with me. I hope you'll come back soon and have a great weekend.